There is a job title that does not appear on any Forbes list, does not show up in a single business magazine profile, and is almost never discussed by the people who hold it. It is not wealth manager. It is not estate attorney. It is not chief of staff. It is historian, not a professor moonlighting for a consulting fee, not a hobbyist compiling a family tree for a holiday newsletter, a retained, sometimes full-time, sometimes multi-generational professional historian with a doctorate, an archive budget, and a mandate that touches almost every other function inside a family's operation. Its trusts, its litigation, its philanthropy, its art collection, its standing with museums and universities, and, most quietly of all, its reputation. This isn't hidden, it's just never taught, because old money hires a historian sounds, on its face, like vanity, like a rich family paying someone to write a flattering book about their ancestors. And sometimes, historically, that is exactly what has happened. We'll get into a very specific, very real case involving one of America's most vilified industrial fortunes and the man who rehabilitated it using nothing but facts, timing, and narrative discipline. But the vanity story is the least interesting reason a family retains a historian. The real reasons are structural. They are legal. They are financial. They are, in several cases, existential. The difference between a family keeping a piece of land, a piece of art, or a piece of its own legitimacy, and losing it. In the next 40 minutes, we're going to walk through 7 distinct functions a family historian actually performs: provenance defense, title and chain of custody research, litigation support, philanthropic architecture, narrative rehabilitation, institutional memory management, and succession continuity using real archives, real historical cases, and the documented mechanics behind each one. No named living individuals, no speculation dressed up as insider knowledge. Just the architecture, because the architecture is public record if you know where to look. Let's start with the most basic question. What does a family historian actually do all day? The historian as infrastructure. When people imagine a family historian, they usually imagine genealogy, a chart, a crest, a claim to some distant lord. That is the least of it. A retained family historian, whether employed directly by a family office, contracted through a private archive, or embedded in a family foundation, typically manages 4 ongoing work streams. First, the archive itself. Old money families accumulate paper at a scale that is difficult to overstate. Correspondence, ledgers, deeds, photographs, shipping manifests, board minutes, diaries, legal filings, often spanning a century or more, often stored across multiple properties, multiple countries, and multiple legal jurisdictions. Without someone whose full-time job is organizing, cataloging, and cross-referencing that material, it simply becomes noise. Worse than noise, it becomes a liability, because unindexed archives can contain the very documents that later prove critical in a legal dispute, and no one can find them when it matters. The Rockefeller Archive Center, established in 1974, and now one of the most significant private philanthropic archives in the United States, exists precisely because the family recognized that its own institutional memory, spanning Standard Oil, the Rockefeller Foundation, and generations of philanthropic giving, had outgrown ad hoc management. It now employs professional archivists and historians whose job is to make that material usable, for scholars, for the family's own decision-making, and for the institutions the family has funded. Second, provenance and authentication. We'll spend an entire section on this shortly, but the short version is that any family holding significant art, antiques, land, or collectibles needs a paper trail proving legitimate ownership across time. And that paper trail has to be actively maintained and defended, not simply assumed. Third, legal and legislative support. Historians are frequently called on by legal teams, not as decision makers, but as expert researchers, to reconstruct the factual record behind a trust dispute, a title claim, or a restitution proceeding. We'll unpack a documented example of exactly this shortly. Fourth, and most delicate, narrative stewardship. Not spin in the cynical sense. Reputable family historians who value their professional credibility will not fabricate or launder facts, but the deliberate, factual contextualization of a family's history for museums, universities, journalists, and the next generation itself. A family history, told badly or left untold, becomes vulnerable to whoever tells it next. A family history that is documented, sourced, and stewarded by a professional retains its own authority over its record. Put simply, a historian is not decoration. A historian is infrastructure, the same category of function as a general counsel or a chief investment officer, just far less visible because their output isn't a balance sheet, it's a defensible, well-organized version of the truth. If you're new to this channel, this is what we do here. We take the parts of generational wealth that are technically public record but functionally invisible because nobody teaches them, and we lay out exactly how they work. Subscribe if you want the next one delivered directly, because next week we're breaking down a mechanism almost nobody outside private banking has ever heard properly explained. Provenance. The paper trail behind every object of value. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. A painting, a sculpture, or a piece of antique furniture is not worth its appraised value unless its history can be proven. Not its beauty, not its age, its documented chain of ownership, what the art world calls provenance. An object without provenance is, in the eyes of an auction house, an insurer, or a museum, functionally suspect. It might be stolen. It might be a forgery. It might have passed through the hands of a Nazi-era forced sale, a colonial-era expropriation, or a disputed estate, any of which can result in seizure, restitution claims, or an outright refusal to insure, exhibit, or sell the piece. This is why major auction houses like Sotheby's and Christie's maintain dedicated provenance research departments, and why the same discipline exists, quietly, inside the collections of old money families holding significant art or antiquities. A family sitting on a multi-generational art collection is not just sitting on assets. They are sitting on unresolved historical questions that can surface at any point. When the piece is sold, when it's loaned to a museum, when it's used as collateral, or when a claimant emerges. The most consequential version of this problem emerged after the Second World War. Hundreds of thousands of artworks were looted, forcibly sold, or otherwise misappropriated from Jewish families across Nazi-occupied Europe between 1933 and 1945. In the decades since, a combination of survivors, heirs, historians, and legal frameworks, most notably the 1998 Washington Conference Principles on Nazi-confiscated art, have driven a sustained ongoing process of provenance research and restitution across major museums and private collections worldwide. This did two things to the world of significant private art ownership. First, it professionalized provenance research as a discipline. Institutions like the Getty Research Institute now maintain enormous provenance databases and employ historians specifically trained in reconstructing ownership chains through the 1930s and 1940s. Second, And more quietly, it meant that any family holding pre-war European art, acquired through any channel, now has a structural incentive to proactively document and, where necessary, resolve the history of every significant piece in its collection, well before a claim ever surfaces. A family historian, in this context, is not a curator arranging a private gallery. They are closer to a forensic researcher working through customs records, gallery sale ledgers, exhibition catalogs, insurance valuations, and correspondence to build and be prepared to defend an unbroken chain of legitimate ownership. The same logic extends beyond art into land. Families holding multi-generational land, estates, agricultural holdings, timberland, water rights, face parallel exposure, boundary disputes, historic easement claims, indigenous land claims, or gaps in the chain of title stretching back a century or more. A title defect discovered during a sale, a refinancing, or a development proposal can freeze a transaction for years. Historians and specialized title researchers are frequently the ones who reconstruct county deed records, surveys, and probate filings to resolve these gaps before they become active legal liabilities rather than after. The pattern across both art and land is identical. Provenance is not a one-time fact. It is a maintained position. And maintaining it requires someone whose full-time job is historical reconstruction, not legal argument, because the lawyers can only defend what the historian has already found. Litigation, the historian as expert witness. If provenance is the quiet preventative use of a historian, litigation is the loud reactive one. Multi-generational wealth generates a specific and recurring category of legal dispute: will contests, trust reformation suits, boundary and easement litigation, restitution claims, and, increasingly, disputes over the authenticity or historical context of donated collections. In nearly all of these, the central legal question is factual, not merely legal. What actually happened, and when, and who knew what? This is where the historian moves from archivist to expert witness. Courts routinely admit historians as expert witnesses, specifically because reconstructing historical fact. What a document meant in the context of the era it was written. What a business practice implied under period-specific law. What a family understood about an asset at a given point in time. Requires specialized historical methodology, not just legal argument. A lawyer can argue interpretation. Only a trained historian can credibly reconstruct the factual record the interpretation depends on. Consider a will contest, alleging that an elderly family patriarch lacked capacity or was subject to undue influence. At the time, a will was executed. The strongest rebuttals in these cases are rarely purely medical. They are contextual. Correspondence showing consistent decision-making patterns. Business records showing the patriarch was still actively directing complex transactions in the relevant period. Diary entries establishing a clear and consistent intent that long predated the contested document. Assembling that record and presenting it credibly is historical research under legal pressure. Or consider a restitution claim on a piece of art or a piece of land, where the family's entire legal position rests on documentary evidence assembled decades or centuries after the fact. Legal teams in these cases routinely retain historians specifically because judges and opposing counsel place far more weight on a documented, methodologically sound historical reconstruction than they do on a family's own oral account of its history. There is a broader structural point buried in all of this: wealth that persists across generations, accumulates legal exposure across generations. Every transaction, every acquisition, every transfer of land, or art or capital creates a historical fact that may, decades later, become the subject of a dispute. A family with no organized historical record is, in a very literal sense, defending itself blind. A family with a maintained archive and a professional historian on retainer is not eliminating risk, but it is dramatically reducing the time, cost, and uncertainty of resolving it when it inevitably surfaces. This is also, quietly, one of the strongest arguments for the family constitutions and multi-generational governance structures we've covered in previous videos on this channel, because a documented decision-making history is exactly the kind of record that protects a family in exactly these disputes, decades after the fact. This is the kind of mechanism that almost never gets covered anywhere else. It's not secret. It's just boring enough that nobody bothers to explain it clearly. If that's the kind of content you're here for, drop a comment with which mechanism you want us to break down next. Trust litigation, provenance disputes, or family archives, and hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Narrative rehabilitation, the Ivy Lee playbook. Now we get to the part of this story that is closest to what people assume when they first hear family hires historian, but the real version is more precise, more documented, and more instructive than the assumption. At the turn of the 20th century, one American industrial fortune had a reputation problem that dwarfed almost anything in modern business history. Standard Oil had been built through aggressive, often ruthless competitive practices, and by the early 1900s, the family behind it was arguably the most publicly vilified in the country, a symbol in the press and in the public imagination of monopoly power and industrial excess. Investigative journalist Ida Tarbell's serialized exposé of Standard Oil's business practices, published between 1902 and 1904, cemented that image in the national consciousness and contributed directly to the antitrust case that would break up the company in 1911. The rehabilitation of that reputation over the following decades is one of the most documented case studies in the history of public relations, and it was built, in significant part, on historical and factual narrative work, not fabrication. The key figure was Ivy Lee, a former journalist widely credited as one of the founders of modern public relations, who began advising the family in the 1910s. Lee's core insight, radical for the era, was that the family's reputation could not be repaired through denial, secrecy, or spin. It could only be repaired through transparency, accurate information, and a consistent, factual public narrative sustained over time. He advised full disclosure of company operations to the press, rather than the stonewalling that had defined the family's earlier posture, and, critically for our purposes, he helped steer the family's public identity toward its philanthropic activity, most visibly its foundational role in establishing what would become the modern institution of organized philanthropy itself. This is the pattern worth extracting. Reputation, at the scale of a multi-generational fortune, is not repaired by hiding the historical record. It is repaired by controlling how that record is contextualized, accurately, consistently, and over a long enough timeline that the new narrative has room to take root. A single generation cannot outrun a reputation built over decades of documented public conflict. But a family that consistently, factually redirects the historical record, funding hospitals, universities, and research institutions, and ensuring that activity is well documented and well communicated, can, over 50 or 100 years, genuinely shift the center of gravity of its own history. This is why philanthropic activity and historical stewardship are so often housed in the same function inside a family office. The family archive doesn't just store the difficult history, it also documents meticulously the corrective history, every grant, every founding gift, every institution built. When a journalist, a scholar, or a documentary producer eventually comes calling, and for families of this scale, someone always eventually does, the family that has a professionally maintained, factually accurate historical record available is in an entirely different position than the family that has only silence and old newspaper clippings working against it. It's worth being precise here, because this is exactly the kind of point where a story like this can slide into something conspiratorial, and that's not what actually happened, nor is it what we're describing. Ivy Lee's approach worked specifically because it was grounded in disclosed, verifiable fact rather than concealment, and it is well documented in business history and public relations scholarship as a case study, not a rumor. The lesson for old money families more broadly isn't hire someone to hide your history. It's the opposite. Hire someone whose job is to make sure the accurate, complete version of your history, including the philanthropic corrective, is the version that's actually accessible when someone goes looking. Institutional memory, the historian, as bridge to philanthropy. There is a second related function that deserves its own attention, because it's arguably the most permanent legacy a family historian produces, managing the relationship between a family's private history and the public institutions that history is eventually attached to. Old money philanthropy rarely takes the form of a single anonymous check. It takes the form of named buildings, named professorships, named research centers, named wings of museums, institutional structures explicitly designed to outlast the individual donor by decades or centuries. A named endowment at a university is, functionally, a piece of permanent public infrastructure carrying a family's name indefinitely into the future. That permanence creates an obligation few people think about. Someone has to maintain the institutional memory connecting the family to that gift, decades after the individuals who made it are gone. What were the terms of the original gift? What did the family intend the funds to be used for? Are current uses still consistent with the donor's documented intent? When a university or museum wants to reinterpret or repurpose a restricted gift generations later, the family or the family's foundation needs a historian who can produce the original documentation and argue, with primary sources, what was actually agreed to. This is not a hypothetical concern. Restricted charitable gifts are legal instruments, and disputes over whether an institution has honored donor intent decades after a gift was made are a recurring feature of nonprofit and trust law. From small college endowment disputes to major museum litigation over deaccessioning restricted collections. A family that has maintained a rigorous historical archive of its own philanthropic commitments is in a fundamentally stronger position in these situations than a family relying on institutional memory that exists only in the other party's records. There's a second, less legal and more cultural dimension here too. Family foundations increasingly employ historians to manage the family's relationship with the archives, museums, and universities it has funded, coordinating access for scholars, managing the family's own use of institutional archives for research, and ensuring the family's own historical narrative and the institution's public-facing narrative about the gift remain consistent with each other over time. It is, in effect, diplomatic work between a private family and the public institutions that now carry pieces of its name and its money, carried out by someone whose expertise is historical fact, rather than public relations positioning. If this is the first time you've thought about philanthropy as a legal and historical infrastructure problem, rather than just generosity, that's exactly the lens this channel exists to give you. Subscribe and consider turning on notifications. We go deep into the mechanics of dynastic philanthropy in several other videos linked below, and this one connects directly to those. Case pattern: European noble houses and the archive as asset. To see how deeply institutionalized this function can become, it's worth looking outside the American Gilded Age model entirely, toward the European noble houses and merchant dynasties that have operated continuously for far longer. Several major European families with centuries-long continuous histories, including a number of former ruling and noble houses, maintain private archives that are treated functionally as assets in their own right, cataloged, professionally staffed, and in some cases partially opened to academic researchers under controlled conditions. The Rothschild Archive in London, for instance, is a professionally run institution specifically dedicated to preserving and making accessible the business and family records of the Rothschild banking dynasty, staffed by professional archivists and historians, and used both by the family and by outside scholars researching European financial history. The logic behind maintaining an archive at this level of professionalism is the composite of everything we've covered. It protects legal and financial interests across jurisdictions and generations. It supports provenance claims on property and art accumulated over centuries. It provides the raw material for managing the family's public historical reputation and, perhaps most importantly, for families measured in centuries rather than decades. It preserves institutional continuity across generational transitions that might otherwise sever a family's connection to its own operating history entirely. This connects to something we discussed in our earlier video on Japanese merchant dynasties and the concept of i.e., the household as a continuous institution rather than a collection of individuals. A professionally maintained archive is, in a very real sense, the physical manifestation of that idea, proof that the family's identity and interests persist as an institution, independent of which individual currently holds them. Families that think in centuries, not quarters, treat their own history as critical infrastructure, because for an entity built to last that long, forgetting is not a passive risk, it's an active liability. Succession: preparing the next generation with the truth. We'll close with the function that ties every previous section together, and the one that matters most for the family's own internal cohesion, rather than its external legal or reputational position. Preparing heirs with an accurate understanding of their own family's history. We've discussed in previous videos the mechanisms families use to prepare heirs for wealth: governance structures, incentive trusts. The deliberate teaching of financial literacy before capital is transferred. An accurate family history is, in effect, the psychological and identity-based counterpart to those financial mechanisms. Heirs who grow up with a sanitized, mythologized, or simply incomplete version of their own family's history are structurally vulnerable in two specific ways. First, they are unprepared for the moment, and for families of sufficient prominence, it is a matter of when, not if, that a journalist, a biographer, or a hostile party surfaces an uncomfortable historical fact the family itself never fully reckoned with internally. An heir blindsided by their own family's documented history in public is in a far weaker position than one who has already absorbed and made peace with the complete record privately, years earlier. Second, and more subtly, heirs without an accurate historical foundation are more susceptible to an oversimplified self-image, either an inflated, uncomplicated myth of pure meritocratic success or its opposite, an inherited guilt disconnected from actual historical fact, either of which tends to produce exactly the kind of poor decision-making and detachment from reality that erodes fortunes across generations. A professionally researched, honestly presented family history, commissioned specifically for internal use, not public consumption, gives the next generation something more durable than a legend, an accurate map of how the fortune was actually built, what it actually cost, who it actually affected, and what has and hasn't been resolved. This is, in the end, the quiet through line connecting everything a family historian does. Provenance research protects the assets. Litigation support protects the legal position. Narrative rehabilitation protects the public reputation. Institutional memory protects the philanthropic legacy. And an honest internal history protects the one thing none of the others can: the family's own relationship to the truth about itself, which is, across a long enough timeline, the thing everything else quietly depends on. This isn't hidden. It never was. It's simply never been taught, because the families who understand it best have very good reasons not to be the ones teaching it. If this video connected some dots for you across everything we've covered on this channel, provenance, trusts, governance, philanthropy, that's intentional, and it's exactly why this channel rewards watching more than one video. Subscribe if you haven't, and let me know in the comments which family or dynasty's documented history you'd want us to dig into next. A historian, on retainer to a family measured in centuries rather than quarters, is not an indulgence. They are one of the quietest and most consequential positions inside the entire architecture of generational wealth, because everything else a family builds, defends, or gives away eventually depends on someone being able to prove precisely and honestly what actually happened. That's the mechanism. If you want to understand the rest of the architecture behind how wealth actually survives across generations, the legal structures, the governance, the psychology, the rest of this channel is built exactly for that. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.